February the 14th, 1988. Police discover the body of a 20-year-old prostitute in a Cardiff flat. She's received horrific injuries.
The act was ferocious. It was savage.
Stabbed at the neck, hit the main artery, and then repeatedly stabbed her to the neck and chest.
Everybody was shocked about this murder. It was vicious, it was brutal, it was absolutely evil.
In the course of the police investigation, numerous suspects were investigated.
New dawn was coming in the Cardiff Bay. They wanted to clean it up. You know what I mean? They wanted this swept under the carpet. Whoever you can charge them.
You have to find who did this, and you have to protect society, but it is also exactly the type of case that will lead to a miscarriage of justice.
But what happened when police developed the valuable crime-fighting technique of DNA?
A profile developed.
I don't want to totally agree and say that it was all about DNA, rare, because it wasn't.
This is the story of the brutal murder of Lynette White, how her death led to the longest murder trial in Britain at the time, and how dogged police work and familial DNA eventually led police to the killer they'd been searching for.
This crime could not have been solved if there hadn't been the advances in forensic science.
At around 9:15 on the evening of the 14th of February, following a call from a concerned friend Leanne Valdet, police forced their way into 7 James Street in the Butetown area of the city in search of local sex worker Lynette White.
When the police officer, who was Sergeant Bisgood, and Leanne go into the room, Leanne's actually kept a little bit further away so she doesn't see it because they think something terrible may well have happened. They go into the flat and then into the room. They discover Lynette's body. He sees it and knows immediately that there's no doubt this is a murder, and a horrible murder at that.
This was really out of the ordinary. It was an extreme case. I mean, I don't think we've had a case like that since, to be quite frank with you.
Obviously, they begin a murder investigation and they have to record the crime scene.
She was stabbed over 50 times.
It was utterly appalling. There were about 6 different injuries which could have killed her and would have killed her anyway. Triangular cuts to her throat. He did it like this, and that was where most of the blood was lost from.
They say that within the science of this sort of attacks that there would have been a sexual element because he stabbed her to the breast so many times.
You don't need to stab 50 times to kill somebody. It's pretty obvious she's going to die. So there was absolutely no need for what he did.
It was a horrendous sadomasochistic incident to happen to a young 20-year-old girl.
It was difficult for the whole community to accept, to get their head around, you know.
The murder of Lynette White was to leave an indelible mark on the small Docklands community of Butetown, where she'd grown up.
Butetown was quite a together community. A little art centre, a video centre. Butetown was a nice little happening place.
Butetown is an overall term within which was Old Tiger Bay and the docks community.
Cardiff Docks at one time was the biggest coal exporting port in the world, and therefore you had this very multiracial vibe in Cardiff a lot earlier actually than was the case even in London.
Black, white, Indian, Chinese, Hindu, Muslim, Jew, doesn't matter what. You're born down there, you're a dog spot. You hit one, you hit another. You hit that boy who was white, you hit me who was black. We all stick together. And that's why I suppose the outside communities didn't like us. And the police don't like us.
But the area had undergone a fundamental change.
So now we come to the time in the late 80s, which was the beginning of the Cardiff Bay Development Corporation's transformation, or as they claimed, regeneration of the old dockland. Local people felt that there was a political agenda at this particular time.
A lot of the people who had lived there for many years were shifted out to other parts of Cardiff, and that caused quite a bit of resentment. And a lot of the people who were moved out were people from ethnic minorities.
It was a hard working class community, and money, 2 pennies were rare to rub together. But because we all felt like we were in the same boat, we looked after each other.
Therefore, when this young woman, Lynette White, was murdered, it was an enormous shock.
Lynette was a sex worker, well known by locals around the streets of Butetown.
Lynette had been working as a prostitute. She was a young woman who was 20, who herself actually was mixed race.
Lynette was well known in the community, obviously, because her family has connections with the community, and her girlfriends loved her, the people in the community loved her. We knew she plied her trade at the old custom house at the top end of Old Tiger Bay. And that was her business, and nobody else's. It wasn't like she was the only one in the world. There was a great deal of sympathy for her amongst the people who knew her and the community in general.
Valentine's Day 1988 was a Sunday, so the big night that weekend was the Saturday.
Lynette was murdered on Valentine's Day, which is something which created an extra resonance, if you like, because Valentine's Day is supposed to be a day of lovers.
Locals were gathering at the popular nightclub Casablanca.
I'm in the Casablanca because we used to work in the Casablanca. My mate Peter used to run it.
It was a big night in the Casablanca. There was a couple of reggae singers down there, Sandra Cross, something like that.
More than one of my brothers was there with their girlfriends at the time. Valentine's night is always a great night because it's lovers' night, so yeah.
Unknown to anyone at the club, Lynette White had been missing for a few days, and her boyfriend Stephen Miller had been searching for her, asking anyone if they'd seen her.
Stephen Miller is the boyfriend of Lynette White, and he was somewhere between a pimp and a ponce. They certainly were calling him her pimp. He objects to that and refuses to accept it, and basically says that he was her boyfriend.
I've heard Miller's supposed to be looking for his girlfriend. We can't find her. Well, don't know where she is.
The young lady had been missing for a while anyway, for just about the last 5 days of her life.
Stephen Miller wasn't aware Lynette had been staying at her friend and fellow sex worker Leanne's apartment, but she too hadn't seen her for some time.
At this stage, the flat had been loaned to Lynette by her friend Leanne Vilday. And Vilday got concerned about having not seen her, and she thought something was wrong. She doesn't know exactly why, but she did.
Increasingly worried, Leanne rang the police. On the evening of the 14th of February, they arrived at the flat at 7 James Street, where they made an horrific discovery of Lynette White's body. Casablanca employee Tony Paris became aware of a police presence in the betting office beneath the flat.
So when I've gone out across James Street, I see a police car outside the bookies, lights flashing. So I thought, what's going on there? I've gone back to the club, told them, look at the bookies being robbed. On our way home that night, the police were still outside the bookies. Which I thought, that's very weird. Things are starting to get weird now.
The real reason for the police presence would soon become known, revealing the gruesome discovery at St. James Street that would scar many lives in Butetown forever.
People just don't get murdered in Butetown, you know what I mean? It just don't happen.
It was, at that time, the most gruesome murder of its type in Welsh history. She had been stabbed over 50 times.
They nearly severed her head. So it was extremely violent. And as you can imagine, extremely upsetting for the family.
A number of people in the community had been at the Valentine's party in a local nightclub called Casablanca.
I can remember the days after the Casablanca because my daughter was born on the 16th, yeah? And I got told about the Lynette White murder on the Monday.
On Monday morning, I go to the post office and my friend's sister says, "Oh, I read Lynette White's been murdered in a bookie shop." I said, "Well, okay." But, you know, bit of a shock, okay.
But I didn't know her at that time until I seen her in the Echo in the evening. I seen a photo of her. And I, oh my God, look at this. You know, I see this girl walking up and down the road, you know.
The gruesome nature of Lynette's killing was filtering through.
Well, what we heard was she was mutilated in a most severe and savage way. That in itself let me know no doc spy or bay boy did that, personally. And I think a lot of other people also, I know a lot of other people agreed with me on taking that position.
Police immediately undertook door-to-door inquiries.
The police that were investigating this took several thousands of statements from various people.
Maybe a couple of weeks later, maybe it might have been a month, they come around with questionnaires. And you filled in a questionnaire to tell them where you was. And obviously it was fresh in my memory where I was then.
They were putting pressure on people in Butetown. They were also putting pressure on prostitutes to give them the evidence, like, was there a controlling punter?
Meanwhile, forensic analysis had turned up some clues.
Some blood is called cast-off. If you were doing this repeatedly, you'd be doing it like that. So your cut hand will be throwing blood. They were able to find various spots of blood which were significant. And they were significant because this was telling you it wasn't Lynette's. They do a novel test, which is why they know that it's male blood, because they find the Y chromosome. So discovery of the Y chromosome, more often than not, means you're talking about a male.
Through investigations, an early suspect emerged.
Witnesses from the time initially identified somebody who had been acting suspiciously very close to where Lynette White's flat was.
A white man seen sitting on some doorstep toward the pier head down the bottom of Bute Street with blood on his hands. And so the word went out there looking for somebody who met that description.
A photo fit picture was released of this individual who was seen as a potential suspect.
We all emptied the docks. All the boys have gone home now to watch the Crime Watch programme, where it shows us this photograph of this white guy, and he's supposed to be 6 foot, seen outside, sat on the steps covered in blood. His hands.
Correctly, they were looking for one single white man. There was never any question of the perpetrator not being white.
After an initial surge of interest in the case locally, the investigation started to slow down, and police had no success in tracking the suspect in the photo fit. They then put together a list of people of interest based on their previous criminal activities. One of the men, whose identity has never been publicly revealed, was referred to only as Mr. X.
A particularly vicious and nasty piece of work. He was a paedophile. He could be linked to some of the people who later became important witnesses in this case, including Lynette herself. He had actually had very similar injuries inflicted on him that were later to be inflicted on Lynette. But in that case, even though he was the victim, the woman who attacked him got a sort of very, very light sentence, a community order. Now, she went after him with a meat cleaver. So in November of 1988, they eliminate him on DNA and fingerprints. And at that point, they think, no, this is hopeless. Like, you know, if it wasn't him, and I think they genuinely believed it was him. I won't understand why they didn't frame him, given the indications of what they did later. Because if you were going to frame somebody, this person was absolutely right for it. Nobody was going to campaign for him. Nobody was going to care. He was an outcast, and understandably an outcast.
Now back to square one, police attention refocused on the local community of Butetown in the hope of finding a new suspect.
They comes back and there's another interview us all. Now some people can't remember yesterday. Never mind 2 months ago, 3 months ago.
What I think happened was that the police felt under pressure to get the perpetrators.
And there was also the political pressure, because they were in the process of redeveloping Butetown at that stage. The development stood still for a while because of this murder. So there was pressure. They didn't have to sort of say, go and find this murderer, solve this, it's bad for business. It was there without being said. You didn't need to say this. They get a statement from a woman called Violet Perriam, who says that she saw people milling around in 7 James Street on the night of the murder. This is now 9 months after the murder that she has this recollection. That then leads to interviews and statements being taken from the core witnesses as they became known, the 4, which is Paul Atkins, Mark Gromick, Leanne Vilday and Angela Pasila. Over the course of that month, they interview them and they get more and more incriminating statements from them.
The investigation now began to move in a completely new direction.
They stopped looking for a white man with blood on his hands and decided that 15 black men were responsible.
And eventually they don't proceed against a number of them, and they settle on the 5. Yusuf Abdullahi, the cousins John and Ronnie Actie, Stephen Miller and Tony Paris.
Opens my door, it's police. Pushes me up against my wall. Anthony Paris, yeah, we're arresting you on suspicion of murder.
I asked them what they wanted. He said, I gotta go to the police station to do the Lynette White. I told them to fuck off, get away from my front door, because I know, I hadn't done nothing, I know they was fucking wrong. And they said to me that if I don't come with them, they'll have to call back up. Started worrying straight away. Went upstairs, said to my wife, I'll be back now in half an hour. 2.5 hours, Kids was there. And I went back for 2 years.
The scupper comes in, he's banging the table. Do I know this John Actie? Do I know Ronnie Actie? Do I know Steve? Do I know all these people? Yeah, I know them, but I don't hang around with them. Well, we say we've got evidence that you murdered us. I said, you simple in the head, you mad.
You would never see them walk in the street together, in a car together, in a dance, at a wedding, anything.
And then he comes in the room and chucks a postmortem photograph of Lynette on the slab. As soon as I realised what he was, without having a proper detailed look, I just flung it off the table. And I don't want to see that. But when I've done that, he wants to argue me now and make some big issue out of it. Just because I don't want to look at it. Because I don't want that in my head. But it is in my head. It'll always be in my head after that picture.
The police put an enormous amount of pressure on them, and in fact they managed to get some kind of confession out of Stephen Miller.
Lynette's former boyfriend Stephen Miller had initially denied involvement, but after several days of interrogation, he began to crack.
What they didn't realise with him is he was an especially vulnerable person. And if you put him under significant pressure, at first, he won't agree with you. But eventually, once you worn him down, he will. And that's basically why they managed to get a confession out of him. And it's also why he didn't confess immediately.
When they were interviewing me, they kept saying to me that they knows what happened. We were all in a Casablanca, and Miller has said to us, oh, I found where she is. She's over 7 James Street. Now, this is what they've been putting in Miller's head in his interview. When you read all our taped interviews, you can see what they're doing. It's like a play.
Leanne Vilday now gave a new statement, naming Miller, the Acti cousins Abdulali and Paris as the killers.
They actually got individuals to give false testimony.
When you read the two girls' interviews, Leanne and Angela's, you can see how the police have been putting things in their head.
The girls now claim to have heard a scream in the flat and to have run there, passing John Acti in the bedroom doorway.
Angela says, I was supposed to be stabbing her on the bed, and I passed the line to somebody else. But Leanne is saying, no, Tony wasn't stabbing her, she's already dead. They wasn't there, they didn't see nothing. It's all they was told to say.
My brother was in a nightclub having a good time. That's what happened. And someone made up, someone must have thought he was Hans Christian Andersen and wrote up this shabby story. And some idiot senior police officer said, run with it.
They left me in a room, but the door was ajar. I was looking out, and there was a roof, and the window was open, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm gonna take off. Yeah, that's just what I'm thinking. Yeah, it's going through my mind, go, just take off through the window. And I'm thinking, no, if you do that, they're gonna go back to your house, they're gonna have me all in the newspaper, whatever. And they said, John Arthur Acti, we're now arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Lynette White, and then they put the cuffs on me. No, and I said, you fucking idiot. I can remember this, you fucking idiots. I told my solicitor in the first interview, they're fitting me up. I knew it. When you haven't done nothing, you know. You know.
They were in different posses, but the way that they were framed in the picture, these boys from different gangs somehow decided to come together to commit this heinous crime, but it was impossible to accept if you knew Tony. And this was the reaction that we had in the community. So I can say in general, most people would not accept this as a truth.
The forensic science, it was screaming, no, only one person did this. There is no evidence that, more than one person did this.
The trial started on October the 17th, 1989, and the men immediately felt the odds stacked against them.
We was gone, every one of us was gone. The judge, I'm telling you now, the judge was making sure of that. Yeah, he was sending us down the river, he was gone. All he used to say was, well, you always got grounds for appeal. And the judge is saying, he's sending you away.
The first trial actually had to be aborted because the judge died. And so they had to go through the whole thing again.
The second trial began in May 1990, becoming at the time the longest murder trial in British legal history, lasting 197 days.
The essence of the prosecution case was that Stephen Miller was the person who had been arguing with Lynette White, who was his girlfriend, and that they had had a disagreement, that he ended up stabbing her, and the other people involved had helped him in that enterprise. Prosecution set out its case. They used these witnesses who were giving false testimony.
We're saying to Leanne and Angela witnesses, tell the truth. Tell the fucking truth. They can't do nothing, you just tell the truth. Which we was saying with these police officers was handcuffed to us, made statements saying that we were making gun motions and cutthroat gestures to the witnesses. Spielberg can't make this up. He can make a movie like this.
In the end, the outcome of the trial was swayed by the admission of Stephen Miller and the sworn testimony of the witnesses.
The jury was convinced by that evidence and convicted them.
I can remember saying, when I was convicted, how can you find me guilty? I've never been in the building. I've never been in the flat, how can you find me guilty?
My brother was sentenced to life imprisonment, and when that happened, it's like the world fell on my head.
In November 1990, 3 of the 5 accused, Yusuf Abdullah, Stephen Miller and Tony Paris, were found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. The other 2 cousins, John and Ronnie Acti, were acquitted because witness testimony put them outside the room.
Jury come back and said not guilty. Well, that was just like, that was just You know, that's something that you'll never forget. It was said like, it was like an echo, not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. When I went to prison, my youngest one, she was 10 months old. When I come out, she was free. Do you know what I mean? So it was difficult.
However, for Yusuf Abdullahi, Stephen Miller, and Tony Paris, the nightmare wasn't over.
They were convicted and jailed, much to the shock of the locals.
I'm looking out of my window and I can see my block of flats and my father's window on the 10th floor. I've never been on my own. I've never been anywhere on my own. It's scary.
If this case happened in the 60s and not the 80s, they would have got hung.
Though convicted, friends and family on the outside felt the evidence existed that would help release the Cardiff Three.
Our parents are saying, like, go and get my son. We're going to get him. My mother's and father's son, simple as that. There's no way I could have let my brother sit in that jailhouse for all that time. I didn't even ask him, did you do this? You know, I just knew my brother's not responsible.
Lloyd Paris started the Free the Cardiff Three campaign with others in Butetown.
We done demonstrations, shouting and screaming, free the Cardiff Three.
People were then determined, more now than ever, to free the Cardiff Three. So you started to see graffiti along Canal Park, free the Cardiff Three. We wanted justice for Lynette White. We had to pressure the media to stop calling her a prostitute, you know, because she was a child.
Advocates emerged in the form of Jerry Conlon from the falsely imprisoned Guildford Four and the US Reverend Al Sharpton.
The Reverend Al Sharpton, he came over. I remember he said to me, as I got off the plane, I was free the Cardiff Three, and it was such a big moment for me when he said that, you know. It was like...
He made an announcement that his legal team had looked at the transcripts of this trial and saw many instances of miscarriages of justice. So we marched up Bute Street and into the centre of town and up to the law courts and to protest their innocence. I know that Lynette's father thought that the boys had done it at one point, but as time progressed, Lynette's mother was saying, I think that the boys who was arrested are the wrong people.
Activists now needed to prove that the evidence on which the Cardiff Three had been imprisoned was flimsy at best. Witnesses Leanne Valde and Angela Pasela claimed screams had been heard from the flat that night that could be heard 70 yards away through their window at St Clair's Court. Lloyd Paris wanted to demonstrate how this could be disproven.
We had these people come and set up a listening device in the room where the sex workers said they heard the screams. And they had a professional opera singer in the flat where the murder happened, screaming at the top of her voice.
And they couldn't pick it up on a nice day. We're not talking about a Valentine's night where cars are beeping and people are singing. Right? Can't pick it up. So we know they never heard those screams.
They must have had bionic ears.
Stephen Miller's evidence had been so crucial to the prosecution, but that too had many holes that were highlighted during the Cardiff Three appeal.
To explain how bad the case against Miller is, they actually missed what amounts to a complete alibi for the most likely time of the murder. He was seen playing pool in a nearby Casablanca nightclub within about 20 minutes of the time they say the murder happened, which is 1:45 roughly, 1:45 to 1:50 a.m. Within 20 minutes of that time, he's seen playing pool, and he's seen playing pool without a change in general demeanour. So what this means is, if Stephen Miller is guilty, he has gone to that flat, committed the most atrocious murder in Welsh history of its type at that time, with or without other people. He has then somehow cleaned all traces of the scientific evidence that tie him to the scene of the crime and to the victim. He has done that without interfering with the dirt on the white parts of his stonewashed jeans. There is not a single trace, not one single human cell from the blood of Lynette on his clothing. If he has done that, he's a criminal genius.
In fact, a psychologist revealed Stephen Miller had a mental age of just 11, and therefore I think that in itself threw a great deal of doubt on the prosecution case.
The extent of the mental stress Stephen Miller had been subjected to on the day of his police interrogation was also being called into question.
There were 19 interviews which lasted almost 13 hours over effectively 4 days. So they put him under incredible pressure. They basically bully him and it becomes a standard text on oppression in a police station. The Court of Appeal essentially say each member of this court was horrified when they heard this tape.
The pressure that was put on Stephen Miller was considered to be unreasonable and onerous pressure because there was no forensic evidence to link the accused with the scene of the crime. They had to come to the conclusion that there wasn't sufficient evidence to convict. Coupled with other inconsistencies, it wasn't an enormous surprise when the convictions were overturned in the Court of Appeal.
4 years after their arrest on December the 3rd, 1989, the Cardiff Three were released from prison.
Malik's brother, I just knew we were coming home, and like, I couldn't hide my my happiness. I'm like,
The Cardiff Three were free, but that meant the killer was still out there. Satish Shekhar had looked at the case and was appalled at the miscarriage of justice. He felt DNA from bloodstains at the flat was the key to solving the murder, and that soon the technology would exist to obtain a reliable DNA profile. He brought his evidence to the Home Office.
What I was saying is, I want these things tested, but I want all the samples stored safely, and I don't trust South Wales Police to do it, because there's been a number of miscarriages of justice. They kept saying the correct course of action is for me to take my findings to the Chief Constable of South Wales Police and trust them. And it was like, no, that isn't happening. You can reopen the case and I will cooperate with that, but there's no way I'm going to trust South Wales Police to investigate itself. They reopened the case, and Lynette's natural mother, Peggy Pasticcio, was instrumental in that happening, because they, while they could just about ignore me, they couldn't ignore her.
To be fair to South Wales Police, they did commit themselves to properly reinvestigate the case.
The investigation was reopened in September 2000 and given to a diverse new unit.
There was a considerable amount of pressure to do this case properly. Not so much to find the person responsible, but to do it properly. We had a thing called an independent advisory group. Now, let me tell you, this was a shock to the system, right? I wasn't used to this. I was being held to account by people who were not cops, by people who were not trained investigators, and by someone I didn't know. I was uncomfortable with it.
The new supervised unit began to look closely at the Lynette White case.
We introduced 2 retired officers from Lancashire who did a full-scale review and reviewed everything about the case. Hundreds of statements. I'm talking about documents like that. We introduced a private company to look at the forensics, 900 exhibits. This was before CSI. We created the room with room dividers. We created the specification of the room where the body was found. We had the wallpaper from the original scene, and we laid that wallpaper on the wall. We reset the scene. We used science to say, well, how did this happen? How did it occur? So the forensic thing was really cutting edge.
The DNA from the blood found in 1988 from items like Lynette's clothing would be crucial for any type of modern-day match, but the samples which remained were limited.
Without being macabre, where there's more blood at the scene, it's a better scene. The sock and the jeans provided a part of a DNA profile. Not enough. We had to grow and build that. So imagine we needed 6 out of 10. to get a hit. We had 4. As we went through 900 exhibits, we found that in the box of condoms, which had all been checked, no one had checked the box. So there was a fine spray of blood on the box, with fine, fine bits of DNA. Very near the box was a cellophane from a cigarette box. We rip off the cellophane off a cigarette box. Everybody saw it, but nobody saw it, because nobody had examined that cellophane. We had it there. So this is how the name came, Cellophane Man. Cellophane Man. Someone had ripped a cigarette box, and a fine spray of blood had gone in there.
In an attempt to get yet more of Cellophane Man's blood, the team returned to the flat to try to uncover any blood missed during the previous investigation. Professor David Barclay undertook a sophisticated process.
What Dave Barclay does is reconstruct the exit route of the killer from 7 James Street, and he does it brilliantly, because everywhere he touches, they get the blood and then the DNA. 1 drop of blood was likely to have been shed by the killer and would have dripped down the wall into the skirting board. They cut that skirting board, scrape it away, and under it they find the blood and they DNA test it, and it matches. So you basically have now several samples.
People still thought in the organisation that those original people had done it. They still thought we were wasting time. They still thought we were wasting money.
Despite the attitude of some within the police, by early 2002, forensic scientists were finally able to obtain a reliable crime scene DNA profile.
It's called SGM Plus, Single Generation Multiplex Plus test. You couldn't have solved this in 1988. Now you can. Now you have this particular DNA test. This is what was missing.
There was concern within the police that there was so little of this material left that they were worried that if they went ahead with this particular test, it would mean that there was nothing left to test. So it really was all or nothing.
A profile developed. What became clear, that none of those people who were arrested, we could find no trace of any DNA or any forensic to tie them to that crime scene. And that was very important to me.
What they didn't anticipate, and you can quite understand that they wouldn't anticipate this, is that the killer wouldn't have committed another crime of that type. So his DNA is not on the National DNA Database.
Murderers, they're like everybody else. They're not like the Hollywood murderers. John Malkovich is not going to be the murderer. It's going to be somebody who's a nobody. Somebody who hasn't got the strength to live life properly.
With the investigation hitting a wall, a member of the team, Detective Paul Williams, decided to dig deeper into a block of interesting numbers within the DNA results.
He said, oh, this is an unusual block of numbers. And the conversation went round, well, is there something we can do to go back to scientists and say, does that unusual block of numbers bring it down to a managing group of people? It did. And from that, we knew we had Cellophane Man.
While the DNA didn't link directly to one individual, it allowed investigators to connect the sample to a particular family using the process of familial searching.
We identified a family. We identified somebody in the system over a number of months now that matched almost perfect. And we went to see this guy, and he was dead. So his son was there. And we knew it wasn't his son. But so we said, are there any siblings? And he said, yes, he has a brother.
And it turns out there was an uncle nobody in the family talked about. That was Geoffrey Gaffour.
Geoffrey Gaffour was a white former security guard who had lived at some time in the Rhondda Valley, which is about 20 miles north of Cardiff.
The team went to Geoffrey Gaffour's home and obtained a DNA sample from him.
We put a surveillance team on Geoffrey Gaffour. We had to track him because we were all confident now this was the guy. Even though we hadn't had the confirmation, we felt this was the guy.
And it's a good job they do, because he then goes around gathering paracetamol for a suicide attempt. They realise that he's trying to commit suicide, and they knock his door in. And they take him to the hospital, and on his way to the hospital, he makes incriminating remarks.
But the question was, Would he live to stand trial?
He did make some sort of admission then. And that's the only admission he ever made.
13 years after I was acquitted, they arrested Carrefour.
So I went back home, I sat down, had a couple of beers, had a glass of wine, and it was a fantastic feeling to sort of think that we've got this.
July 4th, almost 15 years ago, he pleads guilty, and this resolves the case of the murder of Lynette White, and it unequivocally proves the innocence of the Cardiff Five once and for all. It's the first vindication case in Britain in the DNA age.
At his trial, not everyone was convinced Gafour was telling the whole story.
He was someone who had gone to see Lynette White to use her services as a prostitute. A disagreement over price occurred, as I understand it, although he's never been absolutely clear about precisely what happened.
He then says he lost it. You do not stab somebody as viciously as he did to her for £30.
I can't imagine. You know, I'd have to be psychopathological myself to have any idea of how anybody could do that to any other human being.
If there hadn't been this advance in forensic science, he would have continued to live his life without coming to the attention of the police, because he was very, very careful not committing any further crimes.
Gafour received a life sentence for the murder of Lynette White.
When he comes up for release, which he will do on parole, he's got to explain how this crime happened, because you have to consider, is he a risk to other people? How can you consider that if you don't know why he killed her?
Despite Gafour's conviction and the vindication of the Cardiff Five, there is still doubt in the minds of some as to their innocence.
There still remains something of a whispering campaign, and it was certainly the case that the police officers who were involved in the case continued to believe that the people that they had arrested were the individuals who were responsible for the crime. They still continued to believe that that was the case, and I think that remains so even to this day.
But the science of DNA is infinitely more reliable than human testimony.
Read my lips. They did not commit that crime. People still think they did. Gafour did it. He was caught, he was vindicated, and we did it professionally. We did it above board, with integrity, working with partners, working with everybody. And for me, groundbreaking.
DNA proves it, Gafour proved it, and I'm a free man and I'm an innocent man. And everyone else who was on the charge with me is innocent. You know, and basically, they fitted us up and they got away with it.
Ironically, the people who were later prosecuted and jailed were those witnesses who admitted that they had committed perjury as a result of having been badgered to give false evidence at the trial by the police.
The investigation that caught Gafour was extremely well handled and went some way towards restoring public trust in the South Wales police.
The conduct of the Lynette White inquiry phase 2, which was the investigation to try to find the real perpetrator, was exemplary in the end. They did a fantastic job, and they do not deserve to be tarred with the brush of the original investigation.
The boys had been quite damaged from that 4-year incarceration in many ways, and they were never the same.
You don't adjust. It's not just something you're just going to switch off. You can, switch. I haven't switched it off 30 years later. I still don't sleep. Do you know what I mean?
Yusuf Abdullahi, he couldn't cope with it at all, and he became a heroin addict.
And ultimately, Yusuf died, as did his mother, Pauline Abdullahi, before knowing they were innocent.
Tony Paris's father also passed away before seeing his son freed.
He died about 4 weeks before I come out. Yeah, that was a sad day.
And what about Stephen Miller, whose testimony obtained under duress that night sent the 5 men away?
He's so et up because of what they made him do. Feels bad to this day, and there's nothing you can ever do about it. But I'm cool. I get on with him. I don't see no nothing. They took advantage of the guy.
The Lynette White murder was a terrible, terrible murder.
Lynette White, who everybody knew, for this to happen to her was an outrage to everybody. She was a child, and it never should have happened to her.
This crime, despicable crime that it was, could not have been solved if there hadn't been the advances in forensic science.